Welcome back to the Millennial-Review, the podcast where we analyze the current political, cultural, and socioeconomic crises we face from the perspective of the most indebted and disenfranchised generation in history. I'm your host, Justin, here with some ongoing coup coverage that I think will eventually transition into just normal Donald Trump, what the hell is the right doing coverage, that good stuff. But for the time being, we still have the fallout of the January 6th insurrection, the coup attempt, as I like to call it, though that part of it was very, very laughable in a lot of ways. But it's also a huge moment in history that I think has a gravity that we need to take seriously, especially if we view it as like something that is a manifestation of an ongoing and growing movement that is continuing. The far right still has a lot to do with American politics, has a lot to shape within the Republican Party, and if it's the beginning of something more insidious, and Donald Trump was just the very, very early stages, and we're continuing on to a far right, the likes of which was described in Trevor's Rise of the Alt-Right series, that actually manifests in political power, and as it did under Trump, and that continues to grow, that continues to be the Republican Party. And I think there's a lot of reason to think it will continue to be the future of the Republican Party when you look at the Coup caucus. It's only a couple of House reps right now, but the fact that there is not a huge move to censure them, that Liz Cheney is getting the same, is getting like more of a cold shoulder than the QAnon people in this moment, I think is telling of where the Republican Party's going. And that means that the support for people who did the insurrection on the 6th, and I'll have more to say about that later in later episodes and this one, but support for that type of politics is going to grow within the Republican caucus, I think. The question in my January 6th reflection episode was what is this, the beginning of something or the end of something? And I think the Republican Party has made it clear that there isn't the support there to cleave from Donald Trump totally, that Donald Trump still is the center of gravity within the party, and that style of politics and being open to it is really the future of the Republican Party in a lot of ways. I think that was made clear in recent days, and that can change, especially as Donald Trump cedes or fades from memory rather, but I don't think he's going to cede the Republican Party that easily. And I think when you look at the polling, when you look at everything that's happening, the Republican base is still really stoked on Trumpism, and that the manifestation of Trumpism that we saw on January 6th is still present in our politics. And on the left, that's obviously something we need to be aware of and we need to be conscious of, because there is not as organized or as radical a faction on the left that can respond to that style of politics, I think, effectively in this moment. And that's kind of why I'm taking a step back, saying maybe libertarian socialism, where these groups are interacting with the state in really, really offensive ways that I'll unpack later in later episodes, because I think that this is big. The coup attempt, whether there was collaboration, to what extent there was, all of those things. There's a lot to unpack here, and there's a lot of reporting ongoing about it that I think is really, really telling of where the right-wing movement is, where it stands internationally, and just how it could grow into the future. And the left doesn't have that kind of institutional support. The left doesn't have that kind of state power. The left doesn't have those international mechanisms right now as they do. And I think even in the stochastic sense, you can link the Christchurch mosque shooting in New Zealand to the El Paso Walmart shooting in ideology and message board and style. These events are remarkably similar manifestations of far-right violence, and it goes much deeper than that when you start looking at the groups that were coordinating to actually seize power in a coup attempt. The stochastic side of it is one thing. The actual manifestation of these groups trying to seize political power using the same ideologies to mobilize people in that way is a completely different thing. And we're living through both of them at the same time. And I think we're going to see increased manifestations of both of them. And that, I think, is something we we need to take very seriously. And I think this week we had like a historic moment. This last week we had a historic moment in the sense that AOC and others who were there came out with their direct experiences, what happened, what it was like to be a target on the 6th, what it was like to be present for that. And I think that also showed that coming out for AOC, that telling her story, relating it to other events in her life, I think all of that, and I'll dive into that in a minute, but I think all of that really also showed some fissures on the left that are super important and are going to continue to stay with us in politics, and that are just as important as the Republicans choosing Q in some ways, unfortunately. And that's the response to AOC's story that some in the Jimmy Dore Force the Vote camp had. I think maybe I'm too online in this moment, but I think that that's actually becoming a meaningful fissure on the left, and one that is really problematic, especially because it's seeping into everything. I think the Force the Vote contingent of the left, that's kind of nonsensical, kind of, in my opinion, a lot of them, and it's kind of just a bad faith politics in a lot of ways. But I think that contingent is big enough that it matters, and they took that bad faith and turned it on AOC in ways that I'll get into, because I think that it's important when you look at basically anyone who stood against the Force the Vote is now labeled as bad, is now going to be smeared as now a demo or socialist, a leftist in name only, or whatever. It's very reminiscent of Tea Party politics, and again, to go back to one of Trevor's episodes, I think that is the opposite of the style we need to be cultivating on the left right now, and community and inclusiveness and bringing people into the fold and appreciating their experience seems like a better use of the left's energy in this time. And I think there is a lot of that happening, so it's not to be all doomer about it, but I think that this whole moment has shine a light on some really important fissures, both right and left, that we'll continue to follow on this podcast. I'm sure I'll definitely continue to follow the right as they go forward and what that looks like. And at a certain point the coup coverage is going to transition into impeachment and what happens after coverage, but for now there's still some to unpack for what happened on the 6th and everything else. And I think AOC and others recounting their firsthand direct experiences is super important, because it's history. I mean, those were people who were there. Those were that is something that, if you view the moment as one that has the gravity of a 9/11, that has the gravity of a Pearl Harbor or something like that, and maybe that's a little much, but I think when you see some of the response that's being, Patriot Act 2.0 and other things basically that are being posited right now, it's not that it's not that wild, I think, to put it on that scale, and other people are. So it's, when you view it on that scale, people who experienced it firsthand in the Capitol, who were targeted, if there's a list of people that the people who were committing the insurrection wanted to get a hold of on that day, AOC is in everyone's top 5 who was there, probably because of the animosity with which she's portrayed on the right. It's insane, and I think it's telling of the political moment we live in, and she recounts that herself, and she knows that, and she lives with that. And I think that's why the response on the left is so problematic to me in so many ways, because that is a leader and a politician, sure, and someone we need to hold accountable, but she's also a person who went through who experienced a coup attempt. And when you just look at history and the forces that were invading the Capitol and the sort of harm that they would like to commit against people like AOC, that happens. It could have happened. People there wished it happened, and AOC knew that was the case. And I think there's just a disconnect from the personal aspect of this all, and not to make politics personal, but these are people. And I think it's important, just as important for politicians to humanize the working people that they are making policy for. I think there are moments where it's important to humanize politicians, and this is one of them, especially because it was probably incredibly traumatic for a lot of people to live through that moment. And it's not even a probably, because they recounted their experience and made it abundantly clear that it was, and that's going to play into the impeachment. But I think I'll let AOC speak for herself in a second. I think there's a lack of like seeing politicians as people on the left that is problematic in this moment, but is like healthy in other places. So I don't really know what to make of it. But all in all, I just think that this is a really important moment where people are recounting what it was like to be there firsthand for the coup. And that is not something to be taken lightly, just given how enormous this moment is, in my view, just given, we followed the right pretty closely on this podcast for a while, and it all kind of culminated on the 6th, I think, and what happens next, it remains to be seen. But I think if it's going to grow into like a real fascist movement, there's a lot to be learned from how people are responding right now and what's happening right now. And so here's AOC recounting what it was like. So she did an hour and a half long live stream about what it was like, her experience, and in that she recounted that she was a survivor, or is a survivor of sexual assault, and that really drew headlines and really brought a lot of attention to the live stream, and also a lot of vitriolic, really nasty, disgusting victim blaming responses from people on the left even, that I'll get into. But that live stream was separate from this recounting of her experience. This came sooner after the fact, and then the live stream, there's more there, and more, I think, of the like emotional heft to the story there, but just the straight how it felt to be there in the moment was recounted earlier than that live stream. And this is AOC speaking to what it was like to be there and her experience and that of other members of Congress.
Many, many, many members of Congress were almost murdered. Many congressional staffers were almost killed. As for myself, I had a pretty traumatizing event happen to me. And I do not know if I can even disclose the full details of that event due to security concerns. But I can tell you that I had a very close encounter where I thought I was going to die. And you have all of those thoughts where, at the end of your life, and all of these thoughts come rushing to you. And that's what happened to a lot of us on Wednesday. And I thought I did not know if I was going to make it to the end of that day alive. And it is not an exaggeration to say that many, many members of the House were nearly assassinated. It's just not an exaggeration to say that at all.
And I want to say that I'm with AOC on that. I really genuinely don't think that it's an exaggeration to say that many members of the House were at risk of being assassinated that day, just given all of the people who were inside the House. And maybe that risk is exaggerated a little bit, but I don't really think it is. I think that that's the elements of the right-wing movement that were actually inside the Capitol, that were actually going up those stairs, breaking those windows. I mean, the cop was murdered. There are videos of people yelling, like, shoot the cops with their own guns and stuff like that. And there's a lot of that sort of violent rhetoric directed specifically at AOC, obviously, misogynistic, violent rhetoric that's really, really horrible and disgusting. And you can see it in videos of the insurrection. And so I really I think that's one thing that in the response to AOC's recounting of her story, the one thing that people can maybe justify it is that, it was over the top. Like no one was really at risk anyway. And I personally don't think that that's true. I think that if given the opportunity, there would have been members of Congress murdered if the movement could have gotten there, but that's just not what happened that day. And AOC and others were really lucky, I think, in a lot of ways and we as a country are really lucky in a lot of ways and as a left that didn't happen, because I think that would have, if you look at the long scope of this as like the beginnings of a more insidious right-wing movement, potentially, that's the sort of thing that would have emboldened the more radical elements even more. And I think we haven't escaped that emboldening, and that's going to happen anyway. That's how I'm feeling right now. But it remains to be seen, obviously. But I think that just the fact that even AOC is out here telling this story is hugely important in potentially beating back the movement. But I also think it's emboldening in a way, because they look how close these people got to murdering members of Congress that they despise, and that was their goal. And I when AOC says that they feared for their lives and that was a very real possibility, I'm not one to say that that's over the top in any way. I think that is exactly what was at stake on the 6th, and that we got lucky that we avoided something more disastrous. And as AOC said in that earlier clip, she wasn't sure if she could discuss her experience for security concerns, but in her Instagram live stream, she did give a more detailed telling of the people who almost got to her on the 6th and what that was like to experience that. So here's that telling, and I think it really frames the rest of the discussion and where she takes her experience and uses it against the Republican Party in ways that are totally legitimate and justified, and that we should be doing given just how bad the 6th was, what that means for the right going forward, and what it means if we're going to defeat the more insidious elements that we're putting people and like AOC in situations like this.
Like, I'm here, and the bathroom door starts going like this. Like, the bathroom door is behind me, or rather in front of me, and I'm like this, and the door hinges right here. And I just hear, "Where is she? Where is she?" And this was the moment where I thought everything was over. And the weird thing about moments like these is that you lose all sense of time. In retrospect, maybe it was 4 seconds, maybe it was 5 seconds, maybe it was 10 seconds, maybe it was 1 second, I don't know. It felt like my brain was able to have so many thoughts in that moment. Between these screams and these yells of, "Where is she? Where is she?" And so I go down and I thought I was going to die. And I had a lot of thoughts. You have a lot of thoughts, I think, when you're in a situation like that. And like also one of those thoughts that I had was, I just happened to, be a spiritual person and be raised in that context. And I really just felt like, if this is the plan for me, then people will be able to take it from here.
Again, just on like a personal level, that story, putting someone in that situation, is fucked up, and there should be consequences. There should be consequences to the politicians who fostered that sort of political atmosphere and that sort of political movement. And I think just on a human level, hearing AOC tell her story, if you're not moved in some way, if you're not if you don't feel that there should be consequences because they put another person in a situation where they feared for their life, hundreds of people, like that, I don't know, that I think speaks to just the sheer lack of empathy in our politics, and also particularly the demonization of people like AOC, because they are so demonized that there is no empathy. It's impossible because they have been so thoroughly dehumanized on the right, and that is a really problematic aspect in our politics, and it's seeping into the left in a lot of ways. And I think we have to fight that urge, because it is effective political rhetoric that does get people activated, but in the wrong sort of way that doesn't lead to a healthy political culture, or one that I think we want to live with. We don't want you don't want to live in a country where people are put in that situation and feel that way, even though they're people in power who have blood on their hands in so many other instances. I think there is just like something insidious about that sort of politics and normalizing that sort of political behavior, obviously. And if you don't feel that way when hearing AOC just as a human recount her story, then I think that there's something wrong there. And there's a lot of that happening both on the right and the left. And AOC gets into that in her live stream, and I'll let her speak against it in her own words. But I just think that there is a reason that AOC likens this to her experience as a sexual assault survivor, and there's a reason that the public response has mimicked that, because there's a strong parallel there. And it's unfortunate that in this moment, when that parallel is also attached to a budding fascist movement and their attempt to have an insurrection and overthrow our democratic processes in some way, like that, it's even more disgusting, because it should be so clear, abundantly clear to everyone, that that dynamic is at play here on such a like grand scale, with such grave consequences. Like it blows my mind a little bit that AOC's story was politicized as much as it was on both sides. And it's impossible, given the role that these sort of stories and this political atmosphere are going to play in the impeachment trial, and just where the right goes going forward. But I think it's telling that the response was what it was. I think it's telling that the response to Marjorie Taylor Greene, and we got into that at the beginning, but it's telling that the way the right has postured to all of these different actual people's experiences of feeling in danger because of their colleagues, because of the political moment we live in, and just totally brushing it under the rug, ignoring it, trying to delegitimize it in any way possible. And I think obviously when AOC is connecting this to her experience as a survivor, it's even more disgusting. And that's exactly what she did. And I think it's really important in this moment to make that parallel, because this is a shocking, jarring moment, and that's a shocking, jarring parallel to a lot of people. But I don't think it's unfair, because again, the gravity of the situation is such, and it's attached to probably one of the most significant historical events in modern recent history. Like, it's not an unfair comparison at all, but the response, as AOC lays out, it was totally unfair, and is the exact reason that people are unwilling to share their stories of sexual assault, or even in events like this where the stakes are high and there are actual violent people and violent rhetoric on all sides of it, but obviously not all sides of it, particularly from the right. But it's unavoidable if you're in this situation that you'll be met with that sort of response. And as AOC said, that's exactly why she was hesitant to come forward with her story. But again, I think it's just on a human level important to center what that story was, what it meant to AOC, what it meant to people around her. I think another one that got a lot of publicity was Katie Porter recounting her story of being there with AOC, and AOC obviously being scared and kind of frantic, and what that was like for Katie Porter to experience that as well. And that's an event that I think really again solidifies the human aspect of this moment in a way that we should be centering, because it's easy to lose sight of that. And I think a lot of people on the right obviously have, but a lot of people on the left have too, as I'll get into. And I think Katie Porter's experience is also a very humanizing one that is moving to a lot of people, was moving to me, and I think is the sort of firsthand experience that will shape the impeachment trial and the right going forward. And they know that, and there's a reason that AOC's experience had to be undermined, because there's also people like Katie Porter, there's a whole Congress with these experiences, Mike Pence, and it's not going to go away anytime soon. So the right has to do what they can to minimize it, and it's hard to minimize something like this, like Katie Porter explaining what it was like to be there with AOC.
Congressman Porter, what was that like for you? And did you know just how deep Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez's fears were at that time?
Well, at first she saw me, and we waved. I went into my office, and a couple seconds later she knocked and she said, could we come in? And I said, of course. And she began to, her staffer was trying to describe what had happened. And Alex is really usually like unfailingly polite and very personable. And she wasn't even really talking to me. She was opening up doors. And I was like, can I help you? Like, what are you looking for? And she said, I'm looking for where I'm going to hide. And the thing that will always stay with me, the two memories that really, especially as a mom, I think were just really powerful for me, was when she said, I was saying, well, don't worry, I'm a mom, I'm calm, I've got everything here we need, we could live for like a month in this office. And she said, I just hope I get to be a mom. I hope I don't die today. And the second thing is she was wearing heels. And I remember her saying to me, I was wearing flats. And I remember her saying to me, I knew I shouldn't have worn heels. How am I going to run? And we went and we found her a pair of sneakers to wear from one of my staffers so that she could run if she needed to literally run for her life.
Now, again, just the human element. She was afraid she had to literally run for her life. She was afraid that she wouldn't get the opportunity to be a mother. Like, all of those things were running through her mind because the people that were insurrecting the Capitol, literally, those were not misplaced fears. Those people were there to hurt people like AOC, and specifically AOC, a lot of them. And one thing about Katie Porter telling that story that's always struck me is, like, the difference in demeanor, obviously. And there's a reason that AOC's story is a lot more traumatic, is because people were actually targeting her in a way that maybe Katie Porter would be recognized by some people, but the average like first term congressperson is not very recognizable to most people. But AOC, it was just a 31-year-old who stepped into the spotlight, kind of unsuspectingly won a race against someone with a significant amount of power, received a national platform, the likes of which people in her position never receive, and the vitriol that comes with it. And the difference in perception, both for like Katie Porter to AOC, of their like relative danger they were in that experience, is interesting to me, just because like AOC knows the level of demonization she's faced. Going back to like my emo meditation episode, like part of that is that we receive some pretty nasty messages every now and then, and some of them have been kind of personalized, and they stuck with me for like years now. And like AOC receives that kind of shit in bulk every single hour. Like, I can't even imagine the level of vitriol, the level of violent rhetoric that she has suffered in her career, and that they have to like build systems to filter out of their office and their correspondence and everything. It is probably insane, and I have empathy for her on that level, because there's no way that you can't, like, of course you fear for your life if you're AOC. People tell you that they're coming for your life every day, and like that is something that like isn't even that veiled on like Tucker Carlson and the right-wing news, like the level of demonization. And so it's also interesting to me that Katie Porter's there humanizing her in the way that's like Alex is always unfailingly nice, and like it's just like AOC is a first-term congressperson who is in this massive institution, and Nancy Pelosi's her boss now, and like that's overwhelming, and she's just a great colleague. Like, that is a different perspective that I think I wish more people on the right had, because I think everyone to the left of Nancy Pelosi, but particularly AOC and the squad, are all, conniving communists that are out to seek power at whatever cost. And like, some of us wish they were, but they're not. And that's the reality. And when you look at the rhetoric that's used, it's so dehumanizing, it's disgusting, and it seeps into the left in a different form, as I will get into. But I think it's just important to like have these humanizing moments, have these firsthand experiences, and take them seriously for what they are, as people actually like experiencing these things and telling us what it was like, and not just putting them on the politician pedestal all the time, because there needs to be some humanization here, and it needs to be a two-way process. Like, the movement needs to be humanized in the eyes of its leaders as well, and that's really, really, really important, and often why we lose sight of that connection and that vision and the progress that can be built if it's like cultivated in the right way. And I think there's an urge to use these moments to attack people like AOC, obviously on the left, and that's really, really problematic. But it's even more problematic from the right, when there's the a total lack of accountability attached to it if they can successfully demonize people like AOC. And you saw it with the Marjorie Taylor Greene sort of kicking her off the panels on the House vote. There was the rhetorical turn from the Republican Party was, well, what about Ilhan Omar and her anti-Semitism? You're not going to do anything about that? And that's just total bullshit. That's total Islamophobia. That's just weaponizing that entirely. But that is the tactic at this moment. And the tactic against AOC was basically the same. And there's a reason AOC came out with her story as a sexual assault survivor and linked it to this, because that's exactly the same tactics as she says right here.
The reason I say this and the reason I'm getting emotional in this moment is because these folks who tell us to move on, that it's not a big deal, that we should forget what's happened, or even telling us to apologize, these are the same tactics of abusers. And I'm a survivor of sexual assault. And I haven't told many people that in my life. But when we go through trauma compounds on each other. And so whether you had a negligent or, a neglectful parent, or whether you had someone who was verbally abusive to you, whether you are a survivor of abuse, whether you experience any sort of trauma in your life, small to large, these episodes can compound on one another. My story is not the only story, nor is it the central story. It's one of many stories of what these people did in creating this environment. And these folks who are just trying to tell us to move on are just like pulling the page. They're using the same tactics of every other abuser who just tells you to move on.
I want to say, like, straight up, there are a lot of people who think that comparison is totally unfair, especially on the right. And I just want, if the right, in a different political context, maybe that would be fair. Maybe it would be fair to say that like, this was a different situation and the response is nothing like that. But this is literally textbook, probably the response of abusers in those sorts of situations. And the Republican Party is literally gaslighting everyone, trying to act like the last 4 years didn't culminate in a coup attempt and an insurrection and all that entailed, the potential assassination of House reps and others, Mike Pence, like all of that. Like there is an explicit attempt to just act like that was not a big deal, to act like that was nothing happened. And in terms of AOC coming forward with her experience as a sexual assault survivor, there was literally the same tactics, because people started questioning that, like the veracity of that, even though there are no details and there's no reason that she should be compelled to come forward with anything other than what she wants to. But there is an urge on the right, because it's a traumatic experience that she doesn't have to be public with, and they know it. They can just weaponize it against her and act like because she doesn't want to retell it publicly, that somehow she's lying. She wasn't actually where she said she was. People weren't after her, blah, 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 blah. All of those narratives are floating around right-wing media, let alone Twitter, which is like even worse. And on the left, those things are cropping up too, especially on Twitter. And it's just a big morass of awfulness that I think entirely flows from an inability to view the political opposition as human, to view them as, worthy of compassion and empathy and whatever, is required to humanize them in that moment. And there's just a total lack of that in our politics on the right, obviously, and that manifests in so many different ways. But on the left, it's creeping in, and there was a deliberate effort on the left to demonize AOC and particularly this experience and say that it was, somehow the thing I saw was like, and AOC directed or expressed this directly. The thing that I saw was she's just looking for attention or whatever and centering herself. And she says explicitly in that clip that I played that was not her goal, that this is one story of many and she's just coming forward because it's important to. And I think that is admirable given just how traumatic that probably was. And there's just a sheer lack of humanizing these people on the left right now, especially from the force the vote left. And that's what it's coming from, is that political cleavage, because there was just, AOC was central to that in some ways. She was supposed to be the firebrand who stood up and forced the vote on Medicare for all. And because she didn't, she and all who support her are irredeemable. And that manifests in moments like this with vitriol that's totally undeserved, totally disgusting, and totally dehumanizing even further. And I saw explicitly so many AOC's not my friend, and there was a tweet going around recently rebutting that one, but there's so much of that rhetoric, and it's just especially on right-wing media, that the demonization continued and the demonization flowed into delegitimizing that story. And it's just a pattern that you see over and over and over again with sexual assault survivors. But to see it coupled with the gaslighting of what happened on January 6th and trying to minimize all of it, I mean, it makes what AOC did even more important in my mind and even braver. And I really commend her for even being able to speak about what happened on January 6th, let alone make that comparison that I think's apt and was proven in the reaction, if it wasn't already abundantly fair or abundantly clear that it was a fair comparison from the beginning. And so AOC had a lot to say about the tactics of the Republican Party right now, but all of that flows from the need for accountability. And it's the same in sexual assault cases, that those tactics are used to shirk accountability. And that's what's being done here as well, because there is a Republican Party that doesn't want to take responsibility for the fascists within its ranks. There's a Republican Party that definitely doesn't want to take responsibility for actively cultivating that fascism over the last 4 years. That is just the reality here. And there needs to be, I don't know what accountability looks like, and we're going to have to continue the coverage through the impeachment trial and onward to see what manifests here. But I do think that something from the right has to happen. Mitch McConnell and Mike Pence need to take a step back and find a way to cool things down on the right. And it doesn't seem possible with Trump still so enmeshed in the Republican Party.
This is not about a difference of political opinion. This is about just basic humanity. We need accountability, because the accountability is not about revenge. It's not about getting back at people. It's not about any of that. It's about creating safety. And we are not safe with people who hold positions of power, who are willing to endanger the lives of others if they think it will score them a political point. Because they want to, run for president 4 years from now? Who cares? Who cares?
But I want to say that AOC was abundantly clear that this was about the Republicans, that this is about making sure that Republicans hold Republicans accountable, coming forward and getting all of this in the public. So it's part of the impeachment. So it's part of the narrative, because Republicans need to actually hold Republicans accountable, because that's the only way to make this, to make accountability possible, to get anything productive that actually curtails the budding fascist movement. But again, Donald Trump is still around, even though he's off of Twitter and we don't have to deal with him in the day-to-day sense. He still has political ambitions. I don't doubt a second run potentially, if they can't foreclose that somehow. I think that's totally possible. And if not, I think that there's a budding movement there that will be swept up by somebody, and who knows who it'll be. Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley obviously want it, but it remains to be seen. All of that said, though, if that movement is to be stopped, there needs to be something from the right that helps stop it. And I think that's what AOC's getting at with clips like this, where it's like, it's not about politics anymore. It's about stopping something very insidious in our politics, and that is going to take people from all sorts of ideological persuasions, making sure that that insidious element, that violent element of our politics doesn't work its way out. And I think on the left, we have some work to do there too, and it's important to do that work, because I think we're at a position, if our politics devolves into that the left is not at the winning side in any of those scenarios at this moment in history. That's just my perspective. And I think that when you see things like the 6th and the level of violence and vitriol, that vitriol can easily be turned against people and their neighbors, and it happens in other countries. It happens elsewhere all the time. And I think it's fair to say our politics is reaching that level, and that AOC is recognizing that if we don't have accountability, then there's no wheeling it back in, and accountability has to come from within the conservative movement on some level. And that's what AOC is asking for right here.
This is not about a difference of political opinion. This is about just like basic humanity. We need accountability, because the accountability is not about revenge. It's not about getting back at people. It's not about any of that. It's about creating safety. And we are not safe with people who hold positions of power, who are willing to endanger the lives of others if they think it will score them a political point. Because they want to, run for president 4 years from now? Who cares? Who cares? Like, what is the craven extent of your personal political ambition that you want to be president so bad that you're going to allow people and your own colleagues' lives to be in danger because you think it's going to win you Trump's base? And also, from the perspective of a politician, let me tell you, Donald Trump, he runs a cult of personality. That's not going to transfer to you so quickly and easily as a little base. It doesn't work like that.
So in a lot of ways, I think AOC's call for accountability is like a direct call to the Republican caucus, a direct call to certain people within the Republican caucus, particularly calling out Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley. And she directly called out Ted Cruz for encouraging an assassination attempt via insurrection later or earlier in this last week. And that, I think, is obviously important and speaks to what she was getting at in that moment, that like she's working with people who called for an insurrection that really directly targeted her in some ways. And that's an important thing to push forward. That's an important thing to speak on. That's an important thing to connect to the rest of the Republican Party and say, hey, look at what you're enabling and look at what's going on. I think the unfortunate thing is that it appears, just judging by the impeachment vote and everything that's happened there, that the Republican Party doesn't have an appetite for that sort of accountability. They don't really care that much. And in fact, all of this has been continually turned on the left, on Democrats, as, AOC obviously was victim blamed and undermined in any way they could find. But there was also a deeper need to do that on the left via connecting them to the big tech censorship and making all of this about other things that are not the insurrection attempt, that are not the far right fascist movement that fueled that insurrection attempt in some ways, that is fueling our body politic more generally. Because again, that was a call against certain politicians pretty directly from AOC, I think, but also there needs to be a recognition that it's a lot deeper than just those politicians. And my Coup is going to stop them episode, I discussed that like the real problem here isn't necessarily that the coup happened or that the attempt happened, but that there are millions and millions of people who co-signed on it, who thought it was a good thing, who think the vitriol that fueled it is a good thing, that helped fuel that vitriol in their own lives. And that the reckoning that needs to happen happen isn't with Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley. It's Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley found the wave they are riding because it exists within the hearts and minds of millions and millions of people. Donald Trump helped cultivate it. He helped to bring it out, and other people would love to gain political power along the way. And we will deal with the consequences of that as they come. But I think it's important to recognize that even if there's accountability for Josh Hawley, his book isn't published, he gets censured, whatever happens, like the people that fuel Josh Hawley's political ambitions, that he thinks that he can get behind him to ride to the presidency the way Donald Trump did, those voters will still exist, and that sentiment will still exist. And the things that are happening in our political system right now fuel that sentiment even more in a lot of ways. The election being stolen narrative will not go away. Like, it continues. That Donald Trump in some people's minds genuinely is a president in exile at Mar-a-Lago right now, and he's fueling that with his own personal correspondence with the presidential seal and all sorts of other shit. And that will continue, and that these alternate universes that people live in are a much bigger problem than whatever Ted Cruz is saying that fills the space in the alternate universe, because that still exists. Absent Ted Cruz, there would just be someone else filling that space. And that, I think, is a much deeper problem than whatever Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley said on the 6th. And there was a lot of problems there. There's a lot of problems with their political ambitions. There's a lot of problems with the remaining Trumpism. But that is the core problem here. And it's harder to solve because it requires a reckoning on a national level amongst millions and millions of people who have no interest in doing that. And I'll be honest in saying that genuinely scares me in a lot of ways. It scared me when Donald Trump won the Republican primary. It scared me even more when that culminated in the insurrection and the lingering feeling of what's next. And I personally, and like I said, in this moment, feel like that was not the end of a movement, but a newfound life that will continue to grow. And there's a lot of debate as to how to respond to that. And I think politically speaking, there needs to be a strong response in the impeachment trial. Things like AOC sharing her story are an important part of that. There needs to be, deeper than that, though, an actual recognition, again, of the failings of the Democrats to foreclose fascistic style politics by actually providing a material safety net for people, by actually providing a politics that speaks to them. And I think there's ample proof that they actually had that in the Georgia runoffs, that the $2,000 checks and just the actual prospect of material aid, that someone coming to them in this moment during COVID, that was enough to drive people to the polls. I think that even though we can talk about how poorly COVID was used as an issue for the Democrats and that it should have done more for Joe Biden, given just how awful the response has been and just how devastating it's been, it's also true that in this moment, Joe Biden did win. And I think a big part of that is because of COVID. It would have been, I think, probably a lot harder if the economy was chugging along and COVID wasn't impacting everyone's lives and the death toll wasn't rising and Donald Trump wasn't just clearly doing nothing and being incompetent while doing it. I mean, all of those things added up. And in this moment, the prospect of help, the prospect of material aid was enough to win in Georgia. And it would be enough, I think, to cut off the Trumpian elements of the party for a little bit, at least, while they're sort of in shambles, while there is a real genuine potential for contesting Trump's seize or hold of the Republican Party, and for someone else to seize it. You could have Ted Cruz, you could have Josh Hawley, you could probably not Josh Hawley at this point, but who knows? We could speculate all day. Trump kind of came out of nowhere, and I think it's just clear that that's the direction of the party regardless of what happens, because there hasn't been a reckoning from within inside the party. There has not been. The impeachment vote was not that. It was clear that the party is sticking with Donald Trump. People like Rand Paul are sticking with Donald Trump. The party is going to ride the Trumpian wave, and it's more, I think, is can someone other than Trump wrangle that away from him? Not will they stop with that style of politics. But in that moment when that wrangling is possible, the Democrats can make a shift as well, and they can become a party that genuinely champions some progressive policy platforms and planks that Joe Biden didn't run on, but he ran on his website, that make people's lives better, that let people know that the government's there for them. And there's some signs that they're looking into things like that, like like payments for children, like direct material aid that they ran on in Georgia may materialize into a $1,400 check someday. Like, I mean, those things are on offer, and it's not nothing. I think it's not enough. It's not Bernie Sanders. It's not the style of politics we advocate for here at Millennial-Review, but maybe it's enough to prevent more and more people from giving in to the siren song of fascism that Donald Trump is going to keep singing as long as he can, because that's what he does. And that is where his political power lies. And by virtue of that, that's where the political power of the Republican Party lies for the remaining or the foreseeable future, especially given that dynamic I discussed earlier, that this isn't necessarily a problem from the top down. It's kind of a bottom up phenomenon, I think, as expressed on January 6th. And we'll get into in a future episode, I'll get into the like top down elements of what happened on January 6th and what to make of all of that, what to make of what actually happened there, who was involved. But it's important to realize that like the energy and the sentiment that drove people to storm the Capitol exists in communities all across the country and can be weaponized in communities all across the country. And there are people who are banking on that growing and who are banking on building that and riding that to power. And that is the more insidious element here. And the stories of AOC and the politics around it and all of that are important steps in curtailing that movement potentially. But I have come to the conclusion again that I think that this is the beginning of a more immobile or emboldened and mobilized right potentially. And if it detaches from Donald Trump, especially, because if this is just a Donald Trump phenomenon, then that's one thing. But if it becomes a like sentient being all its own, then that is problematic in so many ways. And it looks possible just given the trajectory of things, given that the Republican Party seems to be fitting the Donald Trump mold, even though ostensibly his power over the party should be fading. The party does not seem to be moving on from that movement. And the sentiments that drive things like January 6th, that drive the vitriol against people like AOC, those are going to remain powerful forces in Republican politics in any future primary. And they know it. These people are banking on it. These people are cultivating it. And while there is some promising signs like Lou Dobbs being kicked off Fox News, and there's, some elements of the Republican Party that seem to have see some political future in speaking out against it. It's just, I think, given just what January 6th represents in my mind, it's very surprising the extent to which the party is still latched on to Donald Trump. And we'll see how impeachment goes. Donald Trump clearly pissed off the big money elements of the Republican Party. He clearly pissed off Mitch McConnell and Mike Pence. So the future remains to be written, obviously. But I think that the base of the Republican Party still has January 6th energy. They are still down for fascist uprisings, and I don't think it was the jarring sort of event that would really necessitate a decoupling of the party from Trump and Trumpism and the fascist elements within the party. I don't think that is as strong as it could be. And when you talk about the more organized elements of the alt-right and the far right and what they represent in this moment and what can be done to combat them, there's talk of like a domestic terrorism bill and all of that to help combat that. And on the fringes, that's all really well and good, but it doesn't necessarily beat back the political sentiment of the more moderate, relatively speaking, people who still help fuel that movement but aren't necessarily violent extremists in some way. And that sentiment is really, really strong in our politics right now. And I don't think just silencing Trump on social media is enough to do away with it. I think that there's this like misplaced perception that this is just a bunch of rubes being fed this narrative from the top, and if you silence that, it's just going to end. And while there's elements of that, obviously, the top can very easily be changed. The bottom up structure of the like far right movement and the history and just how deep it goes, like that, you cannot just do away with that by getting rid of Donald Trump necessarily. And that, I think, is what worries me the most, is that like getting rid of Donald Trump and silencing him to the extent that he could be silenced balanced, and just everything that we saw was not enough for the middle levels of that pyramid, the like Republican Congress people, to really step away from it, because they know the base of the party is genuinely attached to this conspiracy-addled far-right politics, this white supremacist politics, and it's not going away anytime soon. And their political careers depend on cultivating an audience, a following, and voters within that base. And that's what they're going to continue to do. Even if I think Mitch McConnell and others, there's a lot of people who would probably like to be able to do that with Donald Trump out of the picture, but I don't think that the Trump family is going to be out of the picture, and I don't think Donald Trump is going to step away quietly necessarily. But there's a lot that remains to be seen. Obviously, he has a lot of personal, financial, and legal obligations that may necessitate him stepping away by the time actually running would happen. So there's a lot going on. But I think at the end of the day, it just needs to be known that like the elements of our politics that invade the congressional offices and make AOC fear for her life are not leaving anytime soon. The elements on the right that justify that enable it, that help it, that cultivate it, are still going to do that, because that's where their political bread is buttered, so to speak. Like, I think that that's just the reality here, and it's an unfortunate one. But it's also needs to be known that like those elements on the left aren't going away either. Like though they are still there, they're still there to be cultivated by the likes of Jimmy Dore, and there's a lot of power in it because it's easy and it's angry and it's cathartic, and people need that in this moment when nothing's happening. So again, I think a lot of both the really sour elements of the left, the really disgusting, dehumanizing elements on both the right and the left, but particularly the right, obviously, those can be you can foreclose the fascistic elements of politics by actually providing for people, by actually doing the work to combat white supremacy, by actually cultivating systemic and structural changes in communities all around the country that are meaningful in people's lives, that democratize their lives, that give them some sense of ownership and feeling of attachment to their community and their country and their people around them. Maybe not their country, we could get a little overboard there, but like, a real sense of community with everyone. I mean, I genuinely believe those sorts of bonds can be built, but it requires at its base a lack of scarcity in people's lives, a lack of competition, a feeling of solidarity that has to be cultivated from the bottom up in a lot of ways, but also from the top down. And this is a moment where the Democrats could do that by starting by just giving people a sense that they're there for them. And I don't have a lot of hope that we're going to get that in a robust way, but at least there might be something. And I think that solidaristic politics is the key to ensuring that this doesn't continue to grow, and that January 6th is potentially a high water mark and not a low water mark on the way to a flood that develops into a actually genuinely fascist movement where we don't have these debates on the left like, is it or isn't it? I think that if we want to foreclose that possibility, that style of politics needs to be on offer more than it is right now. And there are obviously voices like Millennial-Review and but more importantly like Bernie Sanders and AOC and others that are cultivating that politics, that are pushing for a $15 minimum wage right now, that are trying to do what they can to provide healthcare and other services for people in the midst of the pandemic. And then as we go forward, the movement can continue to push for Medicare for all and other things. And obviously all of that's hugely important. And it's just, I think, also hugely important to reckon with the genuinely fascistic elements of our politics that seek to assassinate our elected officials and have them fearing for their lives, because that is a huge, huge problem, obviously. And it's one that isn't going to go away overnight, no matter how much liberals wish it would. And it's one that's going to require a genuine rebuilding of civic democratic society on a level the likes of which we haven't seen since the New Deal. So hopefully something like that is possible, even though the mealy-mouthed Biden administration doesn't give me a whole lot of hope, but there are some rays of sunshine in there that I'm sure Trevor and I will discuss on a later episode, because for now I'm going to leave you. I actually realize that I've been missing a huge opportunity for shameless self-promotion this entire time, and you should all go follow us on social media. Link in the thing on the podcast thing that you're listening to the podcast on, and you can just go click there and give us a like and a follow and all that great stuff. And if you really want to help us out, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Millennial-Review. I'm going to start making more patron-only content, and you don't want to miss it, so join us on Patreon. Thank you so much to everyone who listens, all of you. We love you. And I'll see you next time. Bye.